Ethan Carter slammed his last $20 bill on a diner counter and told the cashier, "Give it to her," pointing at a homeless woman being pushed toward the door in freezing temperatures. The cashier stared. Other customers stared. Even his 7-year-old son stared. Nobody in that diner understood why a man who couldn't pay his own heating bill just spent his last dollar on a stranger. But 3 weeks later, a convoy of black luxury SUVs pulled up outside Ethan's apartment, and everything changed forever. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if kindness still matters to you, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The night it happened, Ethan Carter was already running on empty. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Literally, the gas gauge on his '09 Silverado had been riding the red line for 2 days, and he'd been coasting on fumes and prayer just to make it to work and back. His boots had a crack along the left sole that let in cold air every time he took a step. His winter jacket had a broken zipper he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. His checking account had $43 in it, and rent was due in 11 days. That was Ethan's life. Tight, worn, honest. He wasn't complaining. That was the thing people who knew him always said: the man never complained. Not when his wife Sarah died 4 years ago from a brain aneurysm at 31 years old. Not when the hospital bills came. Not when the landlord raised the rent. Not when the overtime shifts stacked up and he still came home to a little boy who needed dinner, a bath homework help, and a bedtime story, all from one set of tired hands. He just kept moving, because Noah needed him to keep moving. Noah was 7 years old, and the spitting image of his mother, dark eyes, wide smile, that little dimple on the left cheek that made Ethan's chest ache every time he saw it. The kid was sharp too, sharp in that quiet way where he didn't say much but watched everything. He'd sit at the kitchen table doing his second-grade worksheets while Ethan cooked, and every now and then he'd look up and ask a question so precise, so unexpectedly deep, that Ethan would have to stop stirring the pot and actually think before answering. Questions like, "Dad, why do some people have nothing?" Or, "If you found $100, would you keep it?" Or once completely out of nowhere, "Do you think Mom can see us?" Ethan always answered honestly, even when the honest answer was hard. Especially then. It was a Thursday evening in late January when everything began, though. Ethan wouldn't understand that until much later. The temperature in Boise had dropped to 19 degrees by 6 o'clock. The kind of cold that didn't just chill you, it pressed down on you, got into your joints, made old injuries ache, and reminded you that winter didn't care who you were or what you were going through. Ethan had worked a double shift at the depot, 10 hours of diesel fumes and engine grease and crawling underneath buses in an unheated bay. His back was tight. His hands were raw. His eyes felt like sandpaper. But he'd promised Noah they'd have dinner out. It was a small promise. A silly one maybe by most people's standards. But Ethan had learned early on that when you're a single dad raising a little boy in a 2-bedroom apartment on a mechanic's salary, the small promises are the ones that matter most. Because the big ones, the vacations, the new bikes, the trips to the movies, those were harder to keep. The small ones he could control. Thursday, we eat out. Simple, real, sacred. So he'd picked Noah up from the after-school program at 6:15, buckled him into the back seat, and driven 12 minutes down State Street to Patty's Roadside Diner, a place that had been feeding working-class Boise since 1987, with laminated menus and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime around 1987 as well. But it was warm inside, and the portions were big, and nobody looked at you sideways for nursing a single cup of coffee for 45 minutes. They slid into a booth near the window. Noah immediately grabbed the laminated menu and began studying it with the intensity of a man reviewing legal documents. Ethan smiled and picked up his own menu, already knowing he'd get the meatloaf. He always got the meatloaf. It was $9.50 with mashed potatoes and a roll, and it was the best value on the menu, and honestly, it was good. Sarah used to say, a man who orders the same thing at a restaurant every single time is either a genius or completely boring. She'd said it with a grin, and he'd said, "Why not both?" And she'd laughed so hard coffee came out of her nose. He let himself have that memory for exactly 3 seconds. Then he folded it back up and put it away the way he always did. "Dad," Noah said, not looking up from the menu. "Can I get the grilled cheese and the chocolate milk?" "You can get the grilled cheese," Ethan said. "Milk's water tonight, bud." Noah considered this with great seriousness. "Can the water have ice?" "You want ice water in 19-degree weather? It tastes better with ice." Ethan looked at his son. 7 years old, completely unbothered by the cold outside or the math happening in his father's head. Just deeply committed to the principle that ice water tasted better than no ice water. "Sure," Ethan said. "Ice water." That's when the door opened. Ethan noticed her. The way you notice something wrong in a picture, not immediately, not consciously, but somewhere in the back of your brain, something registers. A woman came in from the cold, and the cold came in with her. She was older, maybe mid to late 60s, wrapped in a coat that had seen better decades, carrying a canvas bag on one shoulder. Her hair was gray and tangled, her face weathered and pale. She moved carefully like someone whose joints had been protesting for a long time. She stood just inside the door for a moment, looking around with quiet eyes. Not desperate eyes. Eyes, that was the thing Ethan noticed. Not wild or frantic, just tired, deeply bone-level tired. She found an empty stool at the end of the counter and sat down slowly. The waitress, a heavy-set woman named Donna, who'd been working at Patty's since the Clinton administration came over, glanced at the woman and said something Ethan couldn't hear from across the room. But he could read the interaction well enough. Donna was asking if she was going to order. The woman said something back. Donna shook her head, said something else. The woman nodded once quietly and didn't move. For about 4 minutes, nobody approached her again. Ethan watched this with one eye, while Noah told him about something that had happened on the playground involving a kid named Marcus and a basketball that had gone onto the roof. He listened to Noah. He always listened to Noah. But the other part of his brain, the part Sarah used to call his broken antenna, because it was always picking up signals other people missed, that part was locked onto the woman at the counter. Then the manager came out. How was a younger guy, mid-30s, with a short-sleeve polo shirt, despite the cold, and the kind of expression that said he'd made a decision before he'd even gotten to the counter. He leaned in close to the woman, said a few words, and gestured toward the door. The woman looked up at him, said something short. He shook his head. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She just pulled her coat a little tighter, picked up her canvas bag, and began to stand. And something in Ethan's chest just cracked. Later, he wouldn't be able to fully explain what happened in the next 30 seconds. It wasn't a decision exactly. It wasn't something he thought through. It was more like gravity, like something in him that had been tilting in that direction his whole life finally just tipped over. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a $20 bill, 3 ones, and a Walgreens rewards card. The 20 was supposed to cover dinner for him and Noah, the meatloaf, the grilled cheese, 2 waters, and a tip if he was careful. He looked at it for 1 second, then he was up. "Dad," Noah said. "Sit tight, bud. I'll be right back." He crossed the diner in about 8 steps. Got to the counter just as the woman was shouldering her bag. He put himself between her and the manager, not confrontationally, just present. "There." "Hey," he said to the manager. His voice was calm. That particular kind of calm that comes from a man who is very tired and not in the mood for nonsense. "She's staying." The manager looked at him. "Sir, she hasn't ordered anything. She's ordering now." Ethan turned to the woman. Up close, her eyes were gray, clear, and steady, despite everything. "Ma'am, you hungry?" She looked at him for a moment. Something passed across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like she was deciding something, running a very fast internal calculation. "I don't need your charity," she said. Her voice was quiet but precise. Educated almost. Not what he'd expected. "It's not charity," Ethan said. "I'm buying dinner for my son, and I'm buying it for you. That's just dinner." She held his gaze. "You don't know me." "No, ma'am." He put the 20 on the counter. "But you're cold. And Patty's meatloaf is the best in Boise. I'd hate for you to miss it." Another pause. The manager looked between them. Donna the waitress was watching from across the counter with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Then the woman set her bag back down and sat on the stool. "Meatloaf," she said to no one in particular. Ethan nodded, once turned to the manager, who had wisely decided to stop being a problem, and said, "She'll have the meatloaf, and whatever she wants to drink." Then he walked back to the booth where his son was sitting very still and watching his father with those dark, serious eyes. "Who is she?" Noah asked in a low voice. "I don't know," Ethan said. He picked up his menu. "Doesn't matter." "Dad," Noah said. "Now we can't get the meatloaf." Ethan did the quick mental math. 20 gone. 3 ones left. Grilled cheese was $5.75. His plate would have to wait. "I'll get the soup," he said. "It's fine." Noah stared at him. "You don't like soup." "I like soup fine." "You always say soup is just water that got too confident." Ethan looked at his son. "Did I say that?" "At Grandma's, last Thanksgiving." Ethan pressed his lips together. He had absolutely said that. "The soup here is different." Noah didn't look convinced, but he let it go. He was 7, not stupid. He understood on some level what had just happened. He just didn't have the words for it yet. Donna brought the woman her meatloaf plate without comment. The woman ate slowly and deliberately, the way someone eats when they're forcing themselves not to rush, when the body is desperate, but the pride is still intact. Ethan didn't stare. He talked to Noah about the Marcus basketball roof situation, and drank bad coffee, and ate soup that was in fact just water that had gotten too confident. About 20 minutes in, the woman turned on her stool and looked across the diner at their booth. "Could I?" she said, gesturing at the empty seat beside Noah's side of the table. Ethan blinked. "Sure." She carried her plate over with both hands, set it down carefully, and slid into the booth across from him. Noah watched her with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a 7-year-old. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn Brooks." "Ethan Carter." He nodded toward his son. "This is Noah." "Hello, Noah." "Hi," Noah said. Then, "Are you cold?" She said. "I'm warming up. Our heater at home is broken on the left side," Noah offered as though this was relevant. "Dad puts a blanket over the vent." Ethan cleared his throat. "Noah." "It's true," Noah said, genuinely confused about why it wouldn't be. Evelyn looked at Ethan with something like amusement, quiet, careful but real. "He's honest." "He's painfully honest," Ethan said. "We're working on the filter part." "Don't," she said simply. And she said it in a way that made Ethan stop. "Honest children are the world tries to teach them out of it. Don't let it." There was a silence. The kind that isn't uncomfortable exactly, but that has weight. "So," she said, cutting a small piece of meatloaf. "What do you do, Ethan Carter?" "Bus mechanic, City Transit Depot." She nodded. "How long?" 11 years. "You like it?" I thought about that honestly. The cold bays, the diesel smell, the way your knees ache after a 6-hour shift on concrete. The satisfaction, though, of hearing an engine turn over clean after you've spent 3 hours diagnosing what was wrong with it. The guys in the crew who knew your coffee order and didn't ask too many personal questions. "Most days," he said. "Yeah, I like it." She studied him. "That's not nothing. Most people can't say that." "I know." Another silence. Noah had finished his grilled cheese and was now arranging the remaining pickle slices into some kind of formation on his plate. "And your wife," Evelyn said, glancing at the empty seat beside Ethan, then back to him. She'd noticed then. The absence. The particular way a man sits when he's used to sitting alone. "She passed," Ethan said. 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." "Yeah." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "She was a good person. Better than me, honestly." "I doubt that." "Don't." He said it without bitterness. Just fact. Sarah had this thing where she made everybody feel like the most important person in the room. Didn't matter if you were the CEO or the janitor. She just had a way. Noah got it from her. He glanced at his son, who was now deeply invested in the pickle arrangement. I'm still learning. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly lower. Why did you do that tonight? She asked. What you did? You don't know me. You clearly can't afford to. He looked at her. You needed a meal. That's not an answer. That's a description. He almost smiled. Almost. My father used to say he was a hard man, not easy to know, but he said this once, and I never forgot it. He said, Ethan, the measure of a man isn't how he treats the people who can do something for him. It's how he treats the ones who can't do anything for him at all. Evelyn said nothing. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read, layered, complicated, like there were several things happening behind her eyes at once. Did he live by that? She asked. Sometimes, Ethan said honestly. He was human. Are you? He looked at her. Am I human? Do you live by it? He thought about the $20, about the soup he hadn't wanted, about Noah watching from the booth with those quiet dark eyes that saw everything. I try, he said. That's all any of us can do. Evelyn looked down at her plate. Something shifted in her expression, something that looked just for a moment like grief. Old grief. The kind that's been carried so long, it's changed shape. Yes, she said softly. I suppose it is. She didn't stay long after that. She finished her meal, thanked him with a quiet formality that seemed almost out of place, a little too composed, too precise for the setting. She shook Noah's hand, which made Noah giggle because nobody had ever shaken his hand before. She put on her worn coat, picked up her canvas bag, and walked to the door. At the door, she stopped and turned back. She looked at Ethan for a long moment, just looked the way you look at something you want to remember. You're a good man, Ethan Carter, she said. Then she pushed open the door and stepped out into the 19-degree night, and the cold swallowed her whole, and she was gone. Donna came by to refill Ethan's coffee and said without preamble, That was a kind thing you did. Ethan just shook his head. Anybody would have done it. Donna gave him a look, the flat, knowing look of a woman who has worked in diners for 30 years and has seen exactly what people do and don't do. No, she said, they wouldn't. On the drive home, Noah was quiet for a while. Then from the back seat in the dark, Dad, yeah, bud. That lady was sad. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Yeah, I think she was. Why? I don't know. He paused. Sometimes people carry things for a long time, and it makes them look sad even when they're okay. Another silence. Are you sad? Noah asked. Ethan breathed in slowly. The heater in the truck was working at least warm air on his hands, which still smelled faintly of diesel, no matter how many times he washed them. Outside, Boise passed in amber streetlights and frozen sidewalks. Sometimes, he said. Yeah, but not tonight. How come not tonight? He glanced in the rearview mirror. Noah's small face was barely visible in the dark. Because I had dinner with my favorite person, Ethan said, and he let me try his pickle formation even though I didn't deserve it. Noah's giggle filled the truck cab, and Ethan held on to that sound the way you hold on to heat. They drove home. The $20 was gone. The heater was still broken on the left side. Rent was still due in 11 days. And somewhere out in the Boise night, a woman named Evelyn Brooks was walking through the cold, carrying something far heavier than a canvas bag toward a future that Ethan Carter couldn't yet begin to imagine. He would not think of her again, not seriously, not with any sense that she mattered to his story for exactly 22 more days. That was about to change. 22 days passed. That's how long it took for Ethan Carter to almost completely stop thinking about Evelyn Brooks. Almost. The thing was, life didn't give him much room to linger on strangers from diners. The week after Thursday night, the transmission on Bus 47 blew out during the morning commute, and Ethan spent 14 straight hours diagnosing and partially rebuilding it with a crew of 2, because Martinez had called in sick, and nobody wanted to authorize overtime until the district supervisor personally saw passengers stranded on Federal Way. Then Noah came home from school with a low-grade fever that turned into 4 days of him sleeping on the couch, wrapped in every blanket they owned, while Ethan took unpaid leave and sat beside him reading Captain Underpants out loud until his voice gave out. Then the electricity bill came in at $219, which was $60 more than usual, which meant something was drawing power. It shouldn't be, which meant another problem Ethan couldn't afford to fix immediately, but also couldn't afford to ignore. That was the texture of his life. Problem solution. Next problem. No gaps, no breathing room, no space to sit with anything longer than necessary. He wasn't built for idleness, and life had never offered it anyway. But sometimes at the end of a shift, climbing into the cold cab of his truck and sitting for just a minute before turning the key, he'd think about what she said. "You're a good man, Ethan Carter." Not because it made him feel good. He was honestly a little suspicious of compliments had been since childhood, the way some people are suspicious of food that smells too good before you've tasted it. But because of the way she'd said it. Standing at the door of a roadside diner in a coat that had been washed too many times, looking back at him like she was solving something. Like she'd been asking a question for a very long time, and he was unexpectedly part of the answer. I didn't know what to do with that feeling. So he drove home, made dinner, helped Noah with his spelling words, and went to sleep. Then it was day 8, and Noah asked at breakfast out of nowhere if the lady from the diner was okay. Ethan looked up from the coffee he was making. "What made you think of her?" Noah shrugged, poking at his cereal. "It was really cold last night. I woke up and I could hear the wind and I thought about her." Ethan stood there with the coffee pot in his hand for a moment longer than necessary. 7 years old, and the kid woke up in the middle of the night worried about a stranger. Sarah's son, no question. "I'm sure she found somewhere warm," he said. Noah looked at him with those dark eyes. "You don't know that." "No," Ethan admitted. "I don't." Noah went back to his cereal. "I hope she's okay." "Me too, bud." That was day 8. By day 15, Ethan had convinced himself the whole thing was just one of those moments, the kind that feels significant when it's happening, but turns out to be just a moment, like a song that moves you deeply and then fades. He filed it away, next to other things he'd done in his life, that he was quietly glad about, pulling a kid's dog out of a storm drain on a Sunday morning 6 years ago. Giving a coworker $300 out of his savings. When the man's wife needed a medication, their insurance wouldn't cover staying 2 extra hours to help an elderly neighbor move furniture when every muscle in his body was screaming to stop. Things you do because you're supposed to. Things that don't need to become stories. But day 22 was a Friday. And Fridays at the depot meant the crew ate lunch together in the break room, which meant Dale Huffman was going to talk about something that would bother Ethan for the rest of the afternoon. Dale was a good mechanic and a difficult person. One of those men who believes being blunt is the same as being honest, and has spent 43 years confusing the two. He was eating a sandwich and scrolling his phone when he said without looking up, "You hear? They found that woman?" Ethan was eating leftover pasta from the previous night. "What woman?" "From Patty's, on State Street." Dale glanced up. "You still go there sometimes, right?" Something tightened in Ethan's chest. He kept his voice level. "What happened?" "Lady they'd been seeing around the neighborhood. Older, homeless, gray hair. Found her collapsed on the corner of 12th and Front Tuesday morning. Hypothermia." Dale took a bite. "She's at St. Alphonsus." Ethan set down his fork. The break room was noisy, somebody's radio, the buzz of the vending machine, 2 guys arguing about the Broncos, but all of it seemed to go very far away. "You okay?" Dale said, looking at him now. "Yeah." Ethan picked his fork back up. "Yeah, I'm fine." He was not fine. He made it through the remaining 4 hours of his shift, through a combination of mechanical routine and willful concentration. He torqued every bolt to spec. He triple-checked every connection. He talked to nobody unless absolutely necessary. When the 5 o'clock whistle went, he was in his truck before most of the crew had their jackets on. He sat there with both hands on the steering wheel and told himself clearly and firmly that he was going home. He was going to pick up Noah, make pasta again, because there was still some left, help with homework, and go to sleep. He told himself this for about 45 seconds. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and drove to St. Alphonsus Regional Medical Center. I didn't know why. He genuinely could not have explained it to anyone, including himself. He hadn't known this woman. He'd bought her one meal and shared a booth for 40 minutes. He didn't owe her anything. He barely knew her name. But Noah had woken up worried about her in the middle of the night, and Ethan had raised his son to take that seriously. So he went. The woman at the front desk told him they had an Evelyn Brooks admitted Tuesday, currently stable, but restricted to immediate family only. Ethan said he understood and sat in the waiting area for 20 minutes anyway, as though proximity meant something. A nurse he didn't know walked by, and he thought about asking, and then didn't. I was about to leave genuinely. He had his jacket pulled on and was standing when a younger nurse came through the double doors and stopped because she'd seen him sitting there before, and he looked lost in the specific way that said, "I know someone here, and I don't know what to do about it." "Are you here for Ms. Brooks?" "I know her," he said, which was barely true, and also the most truthful answer he could give. The nurse, whose badge said Carla, looked at him for a moment. "She's asking. She's been awake since this afternoon, and she's been particular about who comes in." Ethan blinked. "She asked for me. She said the mechanic from the diner. I didn't know what that meant until you sat down out here." She paused. "Are you him?" He stood there for a second. "I guess I am." Carla led him back through the double doors. The room was small and plain, and smelled like every hospital room in the world. Evelyn Brooks was propped up in the bed with 2 pillows behind her, a thin blanket pulled to her waist. The hospital clothes and the fluorescent lighting made her look older and smaller than she had in the diner. But her eyes were the same gray and clear and utterly alert. If anything, they seemed sharper now. Like being horizontal had freed up some energy she'd been spending on staying upright. "You came," she said. "I heard you were here." He pulled the chair from the corner the way you do in hospitals. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was found on a sidewalk with hypothermia," she said. "Which is accurate." She watched him. "How did you find out?" "Guy at work mentioned it. Small city." She looked at him steadily. "Why did you come?" He was honest. "I don't entirely know." Something about that answer seemed to satisfy her in a way a more polished answer wouldn't have. She nodded once slowly and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Your son," she said. "Noah. He's well." The fact that she remembered Noah's name, not just his name, but the way she said it, like it mattered to her, hit Ethan somewhere he didn't expect. "He's good. He was worried about you, actually." "Was he?" "Woke up in the middle of the night. Said he was thinking about you because it was cold." Evelyn turned her head and looked at him with an expression that was harder to read this time. Not calculating. Something older and quieter than that. "You're raising him right," she said. "I'm doing my best. Some days the best isn't great." "That's parenthood," she said. "Anyone who tells you different is selling something." A silence settled. Ethan could hear the PA system murmuring somewhere down the hall, a cart going by outside the door. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "When I met you at Patty's, you talked like someone who'd been to school. A lot of school. The way you put sentences together, the questions you asked." He paused. "That's not meant as I'm not saying anything about You're asking why I was on the street," she said simply. He met her eyes. "I'm asking if you're okay. That's different." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said carefully, as though she was deciding how much of a door to open. "I had a life before, a full one. I had resources, connections, work that mattered to me." She stopped. "And then I lost something I couldn't replace, and everything that had seemed important before just stopped mattering. I couldn't make it matter again no matter how hard I tried. So I left. Just left. I gave everything I could give to the people who depended on it. And then I walked away from the rest." She looked at the ceiling again. "I wanted to know what mattered. Not in theory, not on paper. I wanted to really know what it felt like when none of the usual things could protect you anymore." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And what did you find out?" Her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "That most people look right through you," she said. "That cold is colder than you remember from when you were comfortable. That hunger is faster and more demanding than your brain tells you it will be when you've never really been hungry. A pause. And that kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs something, is rarer than it should be. She looked at him. But not impossible, she said. Ethan didn't say anything. He wasn't sure there was anything to say. What did you lose? He asked finally. If you don't mind. The silence stretched for just a beat longer than comfortable. My brother, she said. His name was Thomas. She said it the way you say a name you've been carrying for a long time. Flat and careful, like setting something heavy down on a table. He struggled, she said. For years. I tried to help. Money, doctors, programs, all of it. And then he disappeared, and I looked, and... She stopped, breathed, continued. They found him 3 years ago, on a street in Cincinnati. He'd been there 2 days before anyone called. Ethan's chest went tight. I'm sorry. How was my only family? She said. My parents were gone. I never married. It was always Thomas and me, even when Thomas was... She paused again. Even when things were hard. It was always us. The PA system murmured again somewhere. A phone rang down the hall and was answered. After he died. She said, I started asking myself how. How does a person end up alone on a street? How does an entire system, all those resources, all those people who are supposed to help, how does it fail one man so completely that he dies on concrete and 2 days pass before anyone even calls? Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it the way a river is steady on the surface, and something else entirely below. I decided I needed to understand, not read about it, not fund reports about it, understand it. Ethan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. So you lived it. For just over 2 years. She said that simply, without drama, like it was obvious. You can't lead from outside the experience. You have to know what the cold actually feels like. He sat with that. Lead. She'd said lead, not understand, not research. Lead. Evelyn, he said slowly. Who are you? She looked at him. The steady gray eyes. The particular stillness of someone who is completely comfortable with what they know about themselves and has stopped needing anyone else to see it. Someone who wanted to know if people like you still existed, she said. I didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. He stayed another 20 minutes. They talked about Noah's school, about a book she'd been carrying in the canvas bag that had gotten wet and ruined, about the best coffee in Boise, a specific point on which they discovered they agreed completely. Not Patty's, and then Carla came back and said visiting time was ending, and Ethan stood and buttoned his jacket. I'll come back, he said, because it was true. You don't have to, she said. I know. She looked at him with that layered expression again. Bring Noah next time, if it's not too much trouble. He'd like that. He moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. Evelyn, is there someone we should call family or... No, she said quietly. There's no one. He nodded, didn't push it, just nodded and said goodnight and walked back through the double doors. He sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before he drove away. He wasn't sure what he was sitting with. It was too big to name and too formless to argue with. Just a weight. The specific weight of realizing that a person you thought was a stranger is something else entirely, and you still don't have the vocabulary for what exactly. He picked up Noah from his neighbor Mrs. Garland's apartment, where Noah had been doing homework at her kitchen table, and apparently explaining to her 7-year-old granddaughter the structural weaknesses of the pickle formation, which Ethan chose not to investigate further. On the drive home, Noah asked where he'd been, and Ethan said he'd gone to check on the lady from the diner. Noah went very still in the back seat. Is she okay? He asked. She's going to be okay, Ethan said. She's at the hospital. She got too cold. I knew it, Noah said, not triumphant, just quiet, like he'd been afraid of exactly this. She asked about you, Ethan said. Another silence. She remembered me, Noah said. She said to bring you next time. From the rearview mirror, Ethan watched his son look out the window. Processing. The way Noah always processed things slowly, seriously turning them over like they were objects with weight. I want to bring her something, Noah said finally. Like what? I don't know yet. I'll think about it. Ethan looked back at the road. Okay, bud. Dad? Yeah. She's lonely, Noah said. I could tell at the diner. Some people are lonely and they act normal, so you can't tell. But I could tell. Ethan gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. 7 years old. Sarah's boy all the way through. Yeah, he said. I think you're right. They visited twice more over the following week. Noah brought her a paperback copy of a book about birds he'd found at the school book fair. Not because he knew she liked birds, but because, as he explained very earnestly, birds can go anywhere they want, and I thought that might be a good thing to think about. Evelyn had taken the book from him with both hands and looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. She'd told him it was the most thoughtful gift she'd received in a very long time. Noah had turned pink with barely concealed pride, and then immediately started telling her about the structural weaknesses of diner pickle formations, which, for reasons Ethan did not fully understand, had become his primary conversational opener. By the third visit, she was sitting up straighter and asking sharper questions. She wanted to know about Ethan's work in specific detail, not polite surface-level questions, but real ones. How the fleet was organized, how the maintenance schedules worked, whether the city had been updating the buses or running old equipment into the ground. He answered honestly and watched her process the information with a focus that seemed disproportionate to the conversation. You notice things, he said at one point. I've had a lot of practice listening to people, she said. Most people talk around the edges of what they actually mean. You don't. Is that good? It's rare, she said. I've found it's almost always good. She was discharged on a Thursday. Ethan had offered over her protest to pick her up. She'd argued politely and with clear discomfort about accepting help. He'd said with the same calm he'd used with the manager at Patty's, Evelyn, it is 19 degrees again and I have a truck. You're not taking a bus. She had said after a brief pause, Fine, but I want you to know I find this kind of persistence somewhat irritating. He'd said, I'll put it in my notes. He drove her to a shelter on the east side that she was familiar with and where she knew the staff. She got out of the truck and thanked him with the same quiet formality she always used, and he said to call if she needed anything. She said she didn't have a phone. He reached into his glove compartment and gave her the prepaid he kept for emergencies. She looked at it in her hand. Something crossed her face, not surprise, not gratitude exactly, something harder to name. Something that looked almost like pain. You realize, she said carefully, that you have no logical reason to keep doing this. I know, Ethan said. Most people would have stopped. I know that too. Why haven't you? He thought about it. Really thought about it because she deserved a real answer and not a comfortable one. Because Noah asked about you, he said. And I'm trying to teach him that when someone matters enough to ask about you, don't just ask and then do nothing. You show up. He paused. I'm still figuring out how to do that myself, honestly. But I figure doing it wrong is better than not doing it at all. Evelyn Brooks stood on the sidewalk in her worn coat with a prepaid phone in her hand and looked at him for a long moment. Good night, Ethan, she said. Night, Evelyn. She turned and went inside. He drove home in the dark. He did not know, could not have known that Evelyn Brooks had not gone 2 years sleeping on sidewalks and eating at soup kitchens simply to understand the experience. He did not know about the meetings that had been happening without him. He did not know about the attorneys. He did not know about the sealed documents sitting in a law office in downtown Boise, waiting on one woman's final confirmation. He did not know that Evelyn had spoken to those attorneys 3 times during the weeks she'd spent in the cold around the State Street neighborhood, meeting them briefly in coffee shops, giving careful instructions, asking careful questions. He did not know she'd been watching. Not just him watching the city, watching how people moved around the broken and the forgotten. Cataloging every small cruelty and every rare kindness with the precision of someone who had spent decades building systems and understood exactly what data she was collecting. He did not know that his name was already written down in documents he had never seen. He just drove homemade soup, the kind that wasn't just confident water that Sarah used to make with the carrots and the thyme and the way too much pepper, and called it a good day. 6 days later, the prepaid phone he'd given her went to voicemail. He tried twice more over 3 days. On the 4th day, he stopped trying. He told himself she'd probably lost it, or it had run out of minutes, or she'd moved on. People moved on. That was the nature of it. He told Noah she'd probably gone somewhere warmer. Noah had accepted that quietly, with the same serious patience he accepted most things, and gone back to his homework. Life kept going. The bus fleet needed 2 new fuel injectors. The heat in the apartment stayed broken on the left side. Rent came and went tight, but manageable. March arrived with the particular cruelty of an Idaho March, still cold enough to keep your guard up, but with just enough sunlight to make you hope. And then it was a Tuesday morning in late February. 22 days after the night at Patty's, 11 days after the hospital, 4 days after the phone went quiet, when Ethan pulled into his street after the early shift and saw the cars. Not cars. SUVs. Black. New. 3 of them parked outside his building with the precise, deliberate spacing of vehicles that had been placed, not parked. The kind of spacing that said, "We are here officially, and we know exactly where we are." He sat at the end of the block for a moment, engine running. His first thought, honest and immediate, was, "What did I do?" Because that's the first thing a working man thinks when expensive cars show up outside his house. Not opportunity, not good news, just the cold contraction of a man who has been living carefully and correctly and still somehow feels in his gut that someone is about to tell him he did something wrong. He parked, he got out, he walked toward his building. One of the SUV doors opened, and a man in a dark coat stepped out. Young, early 30s, clean, carrying a leather portfolio, with the posture of someone who was used to delivering information that changed people's lives and had learned to do it without showing anything on his face. "Mr. Carter," the man said. "Ethan Carter." "Yeah," Ethan said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "My name is James Whitfield. I'm with Hargrove Pellman and Associates." The man paused. "We represent the estate of Evelyn Brooks." The estate. The word landed like a stone in still water. Ethan stood very still on the sidewalk. "She passed," he said. "Yes, sir," Whitfield said. 11 days ago, peacefully. She had been ill for some time." He paused. "She left instructions that you not be notified until certain documents were prepared. I apologize for the delay. She was particular about the process." 11 days ago. She had died the same week she'd left the hospital. The same week the phone had gone to voicemail. Ethan stood on the sidewalk in the March cold, with his work jacket unzipped and his hands at his sides, and said absolutely nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then he said quietly, "What do you need from me?" Whitfield opened the portfolio. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I need about an hour of your time." He gestured toward Ethan's building. "I think you should probably sit down for this." Ethan Carter had been inside his own apartment 1,000 times. He knew every scratch on the doorframe, every place. The floor creaked the exact angle. You had to hold the kitchen faucet handle to get hot water without it spitting. He knew this place the way you know somewhere you've scraped and fought to keep, because knowing it was part of keeping it. But when he walked in that Tuesday morning with James Whitfield and 2 other men in dark coats behind him, the apartment felt like somewhere he'd never been before. Whitfield sat at the kitchen table without being asked, opened his portfolio, and lined up 3 separate folders, with the efficiency of a man who did this regularly and understood that the best thing to do was move quickly through the part where the other person was still in shock. Ethan stood by the counter. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to need you to sit down," Whitfield said again, not unkindly. "You said that outside," Ethan said. "I'm fine standing." Whitfield looked at him for a moment, made a small decision, and said, "All right." He opened the first folder. "Evelyn Ann Brooks," he began, "was the founder and majority shareholder of the Brooks Meridian Group, a charitable investment organization incorporated in Delaware in 1991 with operating divisions in 12 states. He paused to let that land. At the time of her death, the organization managed assets valued at approximately $230 million with active community programs in 17 cities. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan said, "Say that number again." $230 million. Ethan put both hands flat on the counter behind him. $230 million. He made $51,000 a year before taxes. His truck had 147,000 miles on it. He'd been nervous about a $219 electric bill 3 weeks ago. She was homeless, he said. She was living as though she were, Whitfield said carefully. By choice. She retained legal ownership and control of her assets throughout. Her management team operated under standing instructions during her absence. For 2 years, Ethan said. 2 years and 4 months, yes. Ethan looked at the ceiling, then back at Whitfield. Why? Whitfield seemed to consider how much of this was his story to tell. Ms. Brooks documented her reasons extensively. There's a letter, I'll get to that. But the short version is that her brother Thomas Brooks died homeless in Cincinnati 3 years ago. She had spent significant resources trying to find and help him. After his death, she concluded that she fundamentally did not understand the population she'd been trying to serve. She couldn't from the position she was in. So she left that position. Ethan thought about what she'd said in the hospital. You can't lead from outside the experience. He'd thought it was a philosophy. It was a plan. How long had she been sick? He asked. Terminal diagnosis came 14 months ago, Whitfield said. Pancreatic cancer. She had approximately 6 to 8 months from diagnosis, her doctors estimated. She outlasted that by 6 months through, by all accounts, sheer determination to complete what she was doing. 14 months. She'd known she was dying when she was walking the streets of Boise in January. She'd known she was dying when she sat down at their booth at Patty's and asked him why he'd bought her dinner. She was looking for someone, Ethan said slowly. Whitfield met his eyes. Yes. She was testing people. I wouldn't use that word, Whitfield said. She was observing. She'd done this in 4 cities before Boise. Portland, Salt Lake City, Albuquerque, and Denver. She spent between 2 and 6 weeks in each location. She had criteria. What criteria? Whitfield paused. This was clearly a part he'd been deciding how to phrase. Genuine action unprompted when no social incentive existed. No audience. No recognition. No expectation of return. He looked at his folder. In her notes, and there are extensive notes, she describes the night at the diner in detail. She notes that you had your son with you, which in her view actually increased the weight of the choice, because it meant you were teaching something. She noted that you didn't look around the room to see if anyone was watching before you got up. She noted that you didn't tell the story loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. She noted that when the manager tried to be difficult, you simply placed yourself in the situation without escalating it. Ethan stood there. She also noted, Whitfield continued with the smallest shift in his tone that might have been professionalism, covering something else, that your son offered her information about your broken heater within approximately 90 seconds of meeting her, which she found, and I am quoting directly here, the most purely honest thing I've seen in 2 years of looking. Something cracked open in Ethan's chest. He turned away from the table for a moment, looked at the wall, breathed. He thought about Noah sitting at that booth with his grilled cheese completely unguarded, just being exactly who he was. He turned back. Okay, he said. His voice was rough. Okay. So she chose Boise. She chose me. And then what? She went back to the shelter after the hospital, and that was it. Not exactly. Whitfield opened the second folder. After you drove her to the shelter in February, she contacted us. Our firm had been managing her affairs during the full period of her absence and told us to move forward with finalization. She spent approximately 9 days at the shelter completing documentation and finalizing her instructions. She passed on the 11th day. 9 days. She'd had 9 days after he dropped her off, and she'd spent them doing paperwork. Did she? He stopped. Started again. Was she comfortable at the end? Whitfield's professionalism softened barely but perceptibly. The shelter staff who worked with her say she was calm. She was working, reading. She apparently finished the bird book. He paused. She asked them to make sure it was returned to Noah if possible. We have it. One of the other men quietly placed a book on the kitchen table. A small paperback with a blue cover. The bird book Noah had given her at the hospital, with a handwritten note tucked inside the cover that Ethan did not read right now, because if he read it right now, He was going to lose it completely, and there were 3 lawyers in his kitchen. He pushed the book gently aside and sat down. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything." Whitfield told him everything. It took 47 minutes. Ethan listened without interrupting, which took every bit of discipline he had, because every 3 or 4 minutes, another piece of information arrived that rewrote something he thought he understood. He sat at his own kitchen table and listened to the architecture of a life he hadn't known existed, being laid out in clean, careful language, and he felt the way you feel when the ground shifts, not falling, not safe, just suddenly aware that what you were standing on was not what you thought it was. The Brooks Meridian Group had been running for 32 years. It had housing programs in Portland, Denver, Salt Lake, and 4 other cities. It funded re-entry programs for veterans, emergency housing for families facing eviction, scholarship pipelines for first-generation college students. In 17 cities, there were people who had a roof over their heads because of Evelyn Brooks. There were kids in college because of Evelyn Brooks. There were veterans who had jobs and apartments and sobriety because of Evelyn Brooks, and almost nobody knew her name. That had been intentional. She was private, Ethan asked. Aggressively private, Whitfield said. She believed strongly that charitable work done for recognition was a different kind of work than charitable work done without it. She said once that a donation that requires a plaque is really just a purchase. Ethan almost smiled. That sounded exactly like the woman who'd told him he was honest in a way that made honesty sound like the most radical possible position. So where does this leave things? Ethan asked. With all of it, the organization, what was she planning to do? Whitfield opened the 3rd folder, and that's when Ethan's life changed. Not the moment 3 minutes later when the specific numbers were read aloud. Not the moment 5 minutes after that when the full scope became clear. It changed in the single second when Whitfield opened that 3rd folder, and Ethan saw at the top of the first page his own name. Ethan James Carter. Printed at the top of a legal document he'd never seen in a process he hadn't been part of about a woman he'd known for 40 minutes over meatloaf and bad coffee. He stared at it. "Mr. Carter," Whitfield said, "Ms. Brooks's will and accompanying trust documentation designates you as the primary steward of the Brooks Meridian Foundation, the charitable arm of her organization, which is the instrument through which all community programs are funded and administered." He paused. "This is distinct from personal inheritance. It is a leadership appointment. You would assume fiduciary responsibility over a fund currently capitalized at $31 million, with ongoing annual endowment contributions from the investment arm averaging $4.2 million per year. The number sat in the room like a physical object. $31 million. $4.2 million per year. "I'm a bus mechanic," Ethan said. "Yes," Whitfield said. "I fix engines." "I'm aware. I don't know anything about running a foundation." Ms. Brooks anticipated that concern. Whitfield pulled out a separate document. "She has established a full operational staff, executive director, program managers, financial officers, legal compliance team, who have been running the day-to-day operations throughout her absence and will continue to do so. Your role would not be operational management. It would be directional leadership, mission oversight, approval authority on major program decisions." He looked at Ethan steadily. In her words, and again I'm quoting directly from her instruction letter, she said, "I don't need Ethan to know how to run a nonprofit. I need him to know what it's for. He already knows that better than anyone I've met." Ethan put both elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a moment. Then he sat back up. "She can't just—" He stopped. "This isn't— You can't just give someone something like this because they bought you a meal." "With respect, Mr. Carter," Whitfield said, "it wasn't the meal." "Then what was it?" Whitfield looked at him. "Would you like to read the letter?" He handed Ethan an envelope. Cream-colored, sealed. His name on the front in small, neat handwriting that was unmistakably precise and unmistakably hers. Ethan held it. "I'll give you some time," Whitfield said. He nodded to the other 2 men, and the 3 of them stepped out of the kitchen with the practiced discretion of people whose job frequently required them to leave someone alone in a room. Ethan sat at his kitchen table with the envelope. He didn't open it right away. He sat with it for a minute, maybe two, just holding it and feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing. Paper, a single sheet inside, maybe two, and also somehow the heaviest thing he'd ever held. He opened it. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in that same small, precise script. He read it once quickly, the way you read something when you can't stop yourself, when your eyes are moving faster than your comprehension. Then he set it down and sat still for a moment. Then he picked it up and read it again slowly, the way it deserved. She began by apologizing for the secrecy. Not performatively, not with the kind of apology that's really just explaining why you were right to do what you did. A real one. She said she understood it was disorienting and that he deserved to have known more, and she'd chosen to withhold information in a way that she acknowledged was not entirely fair to him. She said she hoped he'd understand eventually that she'd been trying to protect the integrity of what she was observing. That if he'd known who she was, everything would have been different, and she'd needed to see who he really was. Then she told him who she was. Not the business, not the foundation, who she was. She'd grown up in Eastern Oregon. She wrote the daughter of a contractor and a schoolteacher. Her father had died when she was 11, and her mother had worked 2 jobs until Evelyn was old enough to work alongside her. She'd gotten a scholarship to the University of Oregon, then a graduate degree in public policy, then a job with a regional development firm, where she discovered by accident that she was extraordinarily good at understanding where money could do the most structural good in a community. She'd built the organization slowly over decades, from a small housing initiative in Portland into something that operated in half the Northwest. Thomas had been 7 years younger than her. Brilliant, she wrote. Genuinely brilliant, the kind of person who understood music and mathematics with equal ease and could make anybody in a room feel like the most interesting person there. He'd also struggled with addiction from his mid-20s on, with the specific, terrible consistency of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and couldn't stop. She'd spent 15 years and considerable money trying to find the right intervention, the right program, the right moment. Sometimes it had worked for months at a time, once for almost 2 years. Then it hadn't. He'd drifted away from contact in his final year. She'd had people looking. By the time they found him in Cincinnati, he'd been gone 2 days. She wrote, I kept asking myself what it would have taken. What one different thing on one different day from one different person might have changed the whole trajectory. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure there is one. But I decided that the only honest response I had left was to spend whatever time remained making sure there were more people in the world willing to be that one different person on that one different day. Ethan read that paragraph 3 times. She went on. I tested 51 people in 5 cities over 14 months, she wrote. I want to be honest about that because you deserve the honesty. Most of them were decent people who simply did not act. A few were unkind. Several were kind in ways that felt performative. They helped loudly or helped and then left quickly, as though they wanted credit but not conversation. A smaller number were genuinely good but frightened. I could see them wanting to help and pulling back, and I understand that. Fear is rational. Fear makes sense. She paused in the letter. There was a small gap, a place where the pen had lifted and come back down. You were afraid too. I could see it. You knew you couldn't afford it. You did it anyway. And then you sat down and talked to me like I was a person, which sounds like a small thing, and is in practice the rarest thing I encountered. Then she got to Noah. Your son, she wrote, is the real reason. Not instead of you, because of you. What I saw at that dinner table was not just a good man making a good choice. It was a good man teaching a child what good looks like in the specific and unrepeatable way that only fathers can teach sons. I lost Thomas partly because the world failed him. But I also believe on the darker nights that we didn't give him enough examples of what it looked like to do the right thing when it cost you something real. You are giving Noah those examples every day. I believe that matters more than we can measure. I am leaving you with a responsibility, not a gift. I want to be clear about the distinction. The money is not yours. The work is yours. The mission is yours to find and protect and amplify the same quality I found in you in as many people and families and communities as the resources allow. I am trusting you with Thomas's memory. I am trusting you with 30 years of work. I am trusting you with the belief that one person given the right tools and the right understanding can close some of the distance between the world as it is and the world as it should be. You don't have to accept. My attorneys will explain the provisions for declining, but I don't think you will decline. Not because you're incapable of it. Because of what you said at the diner. You said your father told you that the measure of a man is how he treats the ones who can't do anything for him at all. You live by that. You know it. You've known it your whole life. This is simply the version of that principle that got a little bigger. Take care of Noah. Take care of the work. And please tell him I finished the bird book. Ethan sat at his kitchen table for a long time after that. He wasn't crying exactly. He was doing that thing that's just past crying, the thing where the body has processed the emotion so fast that by the time you catch up to it, what's left is just stillness. A very full, very heavy stillness. He picked up the bird book from the edge of the table and opened the cover. Her note to Noah was 4 lines. Dear Noah, thank you for the birds. You were right. It is a good thing to think about. Keep asking good questions. Your friend Evelyn. He closed the book carefully. He went to the kitchen doorway and said, Mr. Whitfield. Whitfield came back in. The other 2 men stayed by the door. I have questions, Ethan said. Of course. A lot of them. I expected that. I need to understand exactly what this means. The role, the legal obligations, everything. I need to understand all of it before I say yes to anything. Whitfield nodded. That's entirely reasonable. We have time. I'm also going to need... Ethan stopped. Thought about how to say the next part. I'm going to need you to explain to me clearly what happens to all of it if I say no, because I need to know what I'm actually deciding. Both directions. Whitfield looked at him steadily. If you decline, the trust reverts to a board of trustees who have been pre-selected by Ms. Brooks. The work continues. The programs continue. You receive nothing. He paused. She anticipated that you might feel the weight of the responsibility, and she wanted to be certain you understood that declining does not harm the mission. It simply removes you from it. Ethan nodded slowly. She gave you a real choice, he said. Yes. Ethan thought about that. About a woman who'd spent 14 months being deliberately invisible and had still somehow found a way to make sure he had a genuine out. Who had built a structure that protected itself from his refusal so that his yes, if he gave it, would be completely free. She'd thought of everything. When do you need an answer? He asked. Legally, you have 30 days. Practically? Whitfield permitted himself something very close to a slight smile. Ms. Brooks suggested in her instructions that you would probably want to think about it for exactly 1 night and then say yes, because you are not, in her words, someone who does well with unfinished business. Ethan stared at him. She said that. Verbatim. He almost laughed. He almost actually laughed right there in his kitchen with 3 lawyers about a woman who'd known him for 40 minutes and had apparently taken his full measure. I'll need the documents, he said. All of them. I want to read everything. Of course. Whitfield began assembling folders and sliding them across the table. One more thing, Mr. Carter. He placed one final document on top of the stack. This is separate from the Foundation stewardship. This is Ms. Brooks's personal bequest, a direct inheritance. Ethan looked at the number at the top of the page. He didn't react for a full 3 seconds. $500,000. In a trust specifically designated for Noah's education and Ethan's personal debts. Not the Foundation money. Not the $31 million. Separate from all of it. Her own money from her own estate, set aside specifically for the man who'd spent his last $20 on her meatloaf and the boy who'd worried about her on a cold night. His voice gave out. He cleared his throat. She didn't have to do that. No, Whitfield said quietly. She didn't. Ethan pressed his lips together hard, breathed through his nose, got himself back. Okay, he said finally. Okay. He stood. He extended his hand, because that's what you do. That's what his father taught him. You stand up and you extend your hand, and you look the person in the eye. Whitfield shook it. Mr. Carter, he said, For what it's worth, I've been in this work for 12 years. I've delivered news like this more times than I can count. Most people, when they hear numbers like this, their first question is about how fast they can access it. He paused. Your first question was whether she was comfortable at the end. He picked up his portfolio. She chose well. The lawyers left. Ethan stood in his kitchen alone and looked at the stack of folders on the table. Then he looked at the bird book. Then he looked at the window through which the March light was coming in the way it does in Idaho, tentative, exploratory, not quite ready to commit to warmth, yet, but trying. He thought about $20. He thought about soup that was just water that got too confident. He thought about Noah at Mrs. Garland's apartment right now, explaining pickle formations to a 7-year-old girl who probably had no idea what she was in for. He thought about Evelyn standing at the door of Patty's roadside diner, turning back to look at him one last time. The way she'd looked at him, like she was solving something. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Garland. I need to come get Noah a little early, he said. Something happened. Is everything okay? Mrs. Garland asked. He looked at the folders on his kitchen table, at the bird book, at the handwriting on the envelope with his name on it. Yeah, he said. I think yeah. Everything's okay. He paused. Actually, can you tell him I'm on my way? Tell him I have something to show him. Of course, honey. He's right here. He heard in the background his son's voice asking who was on the phone. Then closer. Noah. Dad. You okay? Ethan pressed the phone to his ear and stood in his kitchen with $31 million worth of other people's futures sitting on his table and $500,000 set aside for his son's education and a letter from a dead woman who had known him better in 40 minutes than most people had managed in years. Yeah, bud, he said. I'm okay. I'm coming to get you. He paused. Hey, you know the lady from the diner? Evelyn? A silence. Yeah, Noah said quietly. She finished the bird book. Another silence. Longer this time. She left you a note in it, Ethan said. I'll show you when I get there. He heard his son breathe. Just breathe for a moment, processing it the way he processed everything, slowly and seriously and all the way through. Okay, Noah said finally. Okay, Dad. Ethan grabbed his jacket and his keys. He had one night to think. Evelyn had apparently already known what he'd decide. He was starting to think she was right. I was up at 2 a.m. Not because he couldn't sleep, though he couldn't, but because somewhere around 1:45, staring at the ceiling in the dark, he realized that lying there pretending sleep might come was less honest than just getting up and admitting it wasn't going to. So he got up, went to the kitchen, made coffee, the way he always made it, when it was just him and the quiet, and sat down at the table with the stack of folders Whitfield had left behind. I didn't read them right away. He just sat with them. The way you sit with something that's going to change your life in the last few minutes before it actually does. The bird book was still on the table. He'd shown it to Noah earlier that evening, sitting on the couch with Noah pressed close against his side, and he'd opened the cover and held it so they could both read Evelyn's 4 lines together. Noah had read it twice slowly. Then he'd taken the book very carefully from Ethan's hands, held it in his lap, and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he'd said, "She was our friend." Not a question. A statement. The kind 7-year-olds make when they've decided something is true, and don't need anyone to confirm it. Yeah, Ethan had said. She was. Are we going to do what she asked? And there it was. His 7-year-old cutting straight to it the way he always did. Not are you going to? Are we going to? Like it was already understood that whatever Ethan decided, they were in it together. Ethan had looked at his son. I'm still thinking about it. Noah had nodded seriously. Okay. Then, Dad, she said you'd already know the answer. She said that to you. In the note. Noah had held up the book slightly. She said, your dad is going to worry he's not the right person. Tell him he already is. Ethan had gone very still. He'd reached out and taken the book from Noah, opened it again to the 4 lines he'd already read. He'd missed it the first time in the bottom margin, written smaller, clearly added after the main note. P.S. Tell your dad he already knows. He just needs one night to catch up to himself. E. He'd sat there on the couch with his son and a dead woman's handwriting, and felt very precisely what it is to be completely known by someone you barely got to know at all. Now it was 2 in the morning, and the coffee was hot, and the folders were on the table, and he opened the first one. He read for 3 hours, not skimming, not looking for highlights. Actually reading the way he read engine manuals when he needed to understand something completely before he touched it. Page by page, document by document. The organizational structure of the Brooks Meridian Foundation. The program inventory. The staff roster, 43 people across 4 states. The financial statements, which were meticulous and transparently managed in a way that told him someone had spent 30 years caring deeply about where every dollar went. The endowment structure. The governance documents. The mission statement, which was 8 words, and the most precise 8 words he'd ever read: dignity first. Systemic change. No one left invisible. He read Evelyn's founding documents from 1991. She'd been 34 years old when she'd started this. 34 with a graduate degree and a clear-eyed fury about the gap between what communities needed and what they got, and she'd just built something. From nothing. Over 30 years. While nobody knew her name, he read the program reports from the previous year. Families housed, 412. Veterans connected to employment, 207. Students supported through scholarship, 91. Individuals moved from emergency shelter into stable long-term housing, 338. 338 people with a roof. Because one woman in Eastern Oregon had decided at 34 years old that the gap between the world as it was and the world as it should be was unacceptable. He closed the last folder at 5:15 in the morning. He sat with his empty coffee cup and the first gray light coming through the window, and the knowledge that had been settling into him slowly for 3 hours, the way a foundation settles, not all at once, not with drama, just gradually and permanently into place. He knew what he was going to do. He'd known since Noah said, "Are we going to?" He just needed the 3 hours to understand exactly what he was saying yes to, because Evelyn deserved a yes that was eyes open, and so did the 412 families, and the 207 veterans, and the 91 students who had no idea that the stewardship of everything they depended on was sitting in a bus mechanic's kitchen in Boise at 5 in the morning. He picked up his phone and sent Whitfield a text. "I'm in. Call me when you're up." Then he went and stood in Noah's doorway for a moment. His son was asleep on his side, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress. The bird book on the nightstand beside him. Ethan watched him breathe for a minute. Just that. Just his kid breathing in the early morning, the most ordinary miracle there was. Then he went back to the kitchen, made more coffee, and started figuring out what came next. Whitfield called at 7:45. "I got your message," he said. He sounded, Ethan thought, genuinely relieved. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure yesterday. Some people need more time." "I read everything," Ethan said. "All of it." "I expected that." A pause. "Questions?" "About 40, Ethan said. "Starting with the staff. I want to meet the whole team before anything is formally announced. I don't want to walk in as the guy who inherited the title. I want to walk in as somebody who's done his homework." A brief silence. Then, "Ms. Brooks said, and I'm sorry to keep quoting her, but she was very thorough. She said you'd say something like that in the first conversation." "Stop," Ethan said. "I'm serious. She left notes about my first phone call. She left notes about most foreseeable contingencies." Whitfield sounded like he might be permitting himself a small smile. "She was a very organized person." "I'm noticing that," Ethan said. They arranged a formal signing for the following Thursday. Whitfield said the foundation's executive director, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been running day-to-day operations for the past 2.5 years, had been briefed and was expecting Ethan's call. He gave him her number. He also told Ethan carefully that the personal bequest, the $500,000 for Noah's education and Ethan's debts, would be accessible within 10 business days, entirely separately from the foundation process and with no strings attached. Ethan wrote down Patricia Osei's number. He did not think about the $500,000. He would think about that later alone, Probably at 2 in the morning again. Right now, there was too much else. He called Patricia Osei at 8:15. She picked up on the second ring. Mr. Carter. Her voice was measured professional, with a warmth underneath it that reminded him faintly of the way good managers sound, people who actually respect the people they work with and don't hide it, but don't perform it either. I've been expecting your call. Ms. Osei, he said. I want to start by saying I understand this is unusual. Unusual is one word, she said. I've been running this organization for 2.5 years without knowing who the next steward would be. Evelyn was private about the search. I knew she was looking. I didn't know she'd found someone until 3 days ago. Ethan caught something in her tone. Not hostility. More like careful assessment. She was measuring him. Which was fair. He'd be measuring her too. What do you think about it? He said. Direct. He'd found that direct was almost always better. A pause. She seemed surprised by the question. Honestly? Please. I think Evelyn made very few decisions carelessly in 30 years, she said, and I have no reason to believe she started at the end. Another pause. I also think you should know that 3 of my program directors asked me when I told them whether the new steward had any non-profit experience. What did you tell them? I told them that Evelyn's specific instruction was that she didn't need you to know how to run a non-profit. She needed you to know what it was for. And what did they say to that? Marcus, he runs our veterans housing program. He's ex-Army, very direct. He said, that either means she found someone extraordinary or she made the worst decision of her life. A beat. He said it without malice. He's just honest. Ethan almost smiled. I appreciate honest. I know, Patricia said. She mentioned that. He let that sit for a second. Ms. Osei, I want to come in before the formal signing. Not as the incoming steward making an entrance. As someone who wants to understand what you've all built before I have any authority over any of it. Another pause. Longer this time. When? She said. This week. Whenever works for your team. Wednesday, she said. 2 o'clock. I'll have the full program staff there. I'll be there. Mr. Carter. She stopped, started again. Can I ask you something? Yeah. Why did you say yes? You could have said no. The organization would have survived. You had a real choice. He thought about it. About the 3 hours at the kitchen table. About the 338 people. About Thomas Brooks dying on a sidewalk in Cincinnati while someone who loved him was still looking. Because I read the program reports, he said. And I thought about what it would mean to be one of those 412 families. To have a roof because some woman in Oregon decided 30 years ago that it mattered. He paused. And then I thought about what would happen to those 412 families if the next person in this seat was someone who cared about the title more than the work. He breathed. I don't know if I'm the right person, but I know what it's for, like she said. Patricia Osei was quiet for a moment. Wednesday at 2, she said. I'll be there, he said. He hung up and stood in his kitchen and realized his hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the specific physical sensation of having committed to something real. He made breakfast. Noah came out at 8:40 hair wild, still carrying the bird book, and sat at the table and said immediately, Did you decide? I decided, Ethan said. You said yes. How do you know? Noah looked at him with the flat patience of a child who has figured out how to read his father completely. Because you made eggs. You only make eggs when something good happened. Ethan looked at the pan. He had in fact made eggs. He hadn't entirely registered doing it. Yeah, he said. I said yes. Noah considered this with appropriate gravity. Then he put the bird book flat on the table and smoothed the cover with one hand, the way you handle something that belongs to you now, and you know it. Good, he said. They ate breakfast. Wednesday came faster than Ethan expected, the way significant days always do. You spend the days before them bracing, and then suddenly, they're just the morning of. He wore his good shirt. Not a suit, he didn't own a suit, and showing up in a rented one felt like a costume. His good dark shirt, clean jeans, the boots without the cracked sole, Because he'd finally gotten that fixed the previous Saturday with money from his regular paycheck. Not any of the other money. Because he'd decided that the other money was going to take some time to feel real, and he wasn't ready to spend something that didn't feel real yet. The Brooks Meridian Foundation's Boise office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Main Street. Ethan had driven past it probably 200 times in 11 years, had never known what was on the 3rd floor. Patricia Osei met him in the lobby. She was 50-something tall with close-cropped natural hair and the posture of someone who stood her ground in rooms without needing to announce it. She shook his hand once firmly, looked him directly in the eye and said, "Ready." "No," he said. "Let's go anyway." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The conference room had 7 people in it. Patricia introduced them around the table. Marcus Webb Veterans Housing, ex-Army, broad-shouldered and watchful in the way soldiers sometimes carry for the rest of their lives. Dr. Sandra Kim, Education Programs, who looked like she could dismantle an argument and a curriculum simultaneously and probably did before lunch. Ray Dominguez, Family Emergency Services, who had the tired but steady energy of someone who'd worked crisis situations for so long that calm had become his permanent state. 3 others, Development Communications, Financial Compliance, each carrying their own particular kind of competence. They all looked at him. He looked back. He pulled out the chair at the near end of the table, not the head deliberately, and sat down. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not nervous," he said. "I am. I fixed bus engines for 11 years, and last Tuesday 3 lawyers showed up at my apartment and told me a woman I'd had dinner with once left me in charge of her life's work." He looked around the table. "I read everything Whitfield left me. All of it. 3 hours, 2 in the morning, because I needed to understand exactly what I was saying yes to before I said it." He paused. "I have questions, a lot of them, and I am asking them as someone who wants to learn from the people who've actually been doing this work, not as someone who thinks he already knows." He looked at Marcus, who was still watchful, still measuring. "I'm told you're direct." Marcus's expression shifted, barely. "Who told you that?" "Ms. Osei." Marcus glanced at Patricia, who kept her face neutral. He looked back at Ethan. "I am direct." "Good," Ethan said. "Go first." A beat. Something in the room shifted, the particular shift of people who came in guarded and are now slightly less guarded, not because they've decided to trust, but because they've seen something they didn't expect. Marcus leaned forward. "Why you?" "I don't fully know," Ethan said. "I bought her a meal. I talked to her like she was a person. My son worried about her when she was gone." He looked at Marcus steadily. "She said she was looking for someone who knew what the work was for. I think she decided I did. I'm not sure she was right, but I'm going to try to be." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "My program has 47 veterans in transitional housing right now. 23 of them are on the waiting list for long-term placement. The funding for the long-term program is up for annual review in 6 weeks." "Tell me about the gap," Ethan said. "What does it cost to close it?" Marcus blinked. "Excuse me. The gap between 47 in transitional and the 23 waiting. What does it cost per person per year to move them into long-term placement? And what's standing in the way? Money, housing, inventory, staff, capacity, something else?" Marcus looked at him. Then he picked up the folder in front of him and opened it. "Per person per year, the long-term placement cost is approximately $18,000, he said. "For 23 people, that's $414,000 annually. The housing inventory isn't the problem, we have units. The staff capacity is manageable. The constraint is funding approval. The annual review hasn't been prioritized above other programs in the last 2 cycles." Ethan looked at Patricia. "Why not?" Patricia met his eyes. "Resource allocation. Every program has a case for priority. Veterans Long-Term was bumped twice in favor of expanding emergency family services, which was facing higher demand. Is the demand still higher?" "It's stabilized," Ray said from across the table. "Then, at the next allocation review," Ethan said, looking between Patricia and Marcus, "I want veterans long-term housing back at the top of the consideration list. Show me the comparative program data, and I'll make the case." He paused. "That's not a decision, that's a direction." You both know this better than I do. If there's a reason that's wrong, tell me. Marcus and Patricia looked at each other. A brief, quick exchange, the kind of look that happens between people who've worked together for years and can have a full conversation in 2 seconds. Then Marcus looked back at Ethan. No, he said. There's no reason that's wrong. Something in the room settled. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. They talked for 2.5 hours. Ethan asked questions and listened to the answers with the same attention he brought to a diagnostic problem on an engine fully, without interrupting, tracking each variable and how it connected to the others. He asked Sandra Kim about the scholarship pipeline and why the college persistence rate was 8 points below the industry average for similar programs, and whether anyone had done exit interviews with students who didn't complete. She looked at him as if he'd said something she'd been trying to get someone to say for 3 years. He asked Ray about the eviction prevention program's triage criteria, and whether the current criteria was optimizing for the cases easiest to solve, or the cases most at risk of spiraling. Ray set down his pen very slowly and said, "That is a question I have wanted someone in a decision-making seat to ask for 2 years. Ethan wasn't performing knowledge he didn't have. He was doing what he'd always done, looking at a system that wasn't working perfectly and asking what was preventing it from working better. He didn't have a non-profit vocabulary. He had a mechanic's instinct for where the friction was. By 4:30, when the meeting broke up, something had changed in the room. Not everything trust takes time, and Ethan understood that, but something real. Marcus shook his hand at the door and said without preamble, "You did your homework." That was it. That was Marcus's version of approval, and Ethan took it. Sandra Kim stopped him in the hallway and said, "Those exit interviews, can I have authorization to start them before the formal signing?" "Yes," he said. "Do it." She nodded once and walked away. Patricia walked him back to the lobby. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "Evelyn was right," she said. "I want you to know I wasn't sure she was going to be. I was prepared to manage the transition professionally regardless. But she was right." He didn't know what to do with that, so he just said, "I have a lot to learn." "Yes," she said. "You do." A pause. "But you know what it's for. The rest is learnable." He drove home. He picked up Noah from Mrs. Garland's, where Noah had apparently been telling Mrs. Garland's granddaughter about the bird book, and why it was important to think about being able to go anywhere you wanted, and Mrs. Garland had given him a snack and told him he was a very unusual child, which Noah had accepted as a compliment. In the truck on the way home, Noah asked how it went. "Good," Ethan said. "Were they nice?" "They were honest. That's better." Noah thought about that. "Were you scared?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "But you did it anyway." "Yeah, bud." Noah looked out the window. "That's what you always tell me. You don't have to not be scared. You just have to do it anyway." Ethan gripped the wheel. "I tell you that," he said. "All the time," Noah said. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. He just drove through the Boise streets he'd been driving for 15 years, past the depot and the diner and the hospital, and every ordinary landmark of an ordinary life that had, in the space of one Tuesday morning, become something else entirely. "Hey, bud," he said. "Yeah. Your mom would have thought this was the most insane thing that ever happened." Noah was quiet for a second. Then he said, "And also the most right thing." Ethan felt his throat close. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "And also that." The formal signing was Thursday. Whitfield and 2 colleagues, Patricia O.C., Ethan, and a notary public in a room with good lighting and a table too large for the number of people at it. Ethan signed 11 documents. He read all of them, which took 40 minutes, which Whitfield had clearly not expected, but accepted without complaint. Ethan initialed every page. He asked 4 clarifying questions during the reading, 3 of which required Whitfield to check his notes, and 1 of which prompted a brief consultation between Whitfield and his colleague before being answered. When the last document was signed and witnessed, Whitfield closed his portfolio, looked at Ethan and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. You are the official steward of the Brooks Meridian Foundation." Ethan put the pen down. "What happens now?" he asked. that Whitfield said is now your question to answer. Ethan looked at the signed documents on the table. 30 years of Evelyn Brooks's work. $31 million. 43 staff members. 412 families. 207 veterans. 91 students. And a bus mechanic from Boise, sitting at a too-large table in a room with good lighting, who had started all of this by spending his last $20 on a stranger's dinner. I thought about what his father had said. The measure of a man is how he treats the ones who can't do anything for him at all. He thought about what Evelyn had written. Dignity first. Systemic change. No one left invisible. He thought about Thomas Brooks dying on a Cincinnati sidewalk and the 2 days that passed before anyone called. He thought about the 23 veterans on the waiting list for long-term housing. He thought about Sandra Kim's exit interviews that nobody had gotten around to doing. He thought about what Noah had said in the truck, and also the most right thing. He picked up the pen again and wrote on the clean notepad Whitfield had left beside the documents 4 words. He wrote, "Start with the veterans." He tore the page off, folded it, and slid it into his shirt pocket. Then he stood up, buttoned his jacket, thanked Whitfield, and walked out into the March afternoon. I had a foundation to learn. 43 people who were going to need to trust him, and he was going to have to earn that one meeting at a time. He had a staff structure to understand and program gaps to analyze and funding cycles to navigate, and a governance board to be accountable to, and a dead woman's 30 years of work to honor without dismantling what made it work in the first place. He had a son to raise through all of it. He had a broken left side heater. He was going to get properly fixed this week with his own money because some things just needed doing. And he had for the first time since Sarah died. For the first time since $43 and a $20 bill and a freezing diner in January. The sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Not comfortable. Not certain. But right. The specific, quiet, costly rightness of a man who had stopped running from what he was always going to become. He got in his truck. He started the engine. He drove toward whatever came next. The first year was the hardest, not because the work was beyond him, though there were weeks early on when it felt that way. Not because the staff didn't come around, they did slowly and honestly, which was the only way Ethan would have wanted it. It was hard because hard work done right is always hard, and Ethan had never been the kind of man who confused difficulty with wrongness. Difficulty just meant you were doing something that mattered. He kept his job at the depot for the first 4 months. That surprised people. Whitfield had mentioned diplomatically that the foundation steward role typically commanded a salary that would make the bus mechanic position unnecessary. Ethan had said equally diplomatically that he wasn't ready to leave until he understood the new work well enough to give it everything it needed. Patricia had not been diplomatic at all, she'd said flatly. That's either admirable or irrational, and I haven't decided which. He'd said probably both, and she'd decided at that point that he was going to be fine. I went to the depot Monday through Friday, 6 to 2:30. He went to the foundation office Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and all day Saturday. He read at night. He called Patricia with questions at hours she'd told him were acceptable, and twice at hours that were not, for which he apologized, and she said, forget it, because both times the questions had been good ones. In those first 4 months, he learned the budget cycles, the grant structures, the reporting requirements, the regulatory landscape. He learned which program partnerships were solid and which were held together by relationships that were one personnel change away from dissolving. He learned that the education program's college persistence problem was exactly what he'd suspected: students were being connected to colleges without adequate support infrastructure on the other end, and that Sandra Kim had 3 proposed solutions she'd been trying to get someone to approve for 18 months. He approved all 3 in the same meeting. Sandra had looked at him with an expression that was not quite belief and not quite relief, but somewhere exactly between them. He met the veterans in Marcus's program one Tuesday afternoon in April. Marcus had not arranged it as a formal visit. He'd simply said at the end of a budget meeting, "You want to come by the transitional house on Tuesday," like it was optional, like it didn't matter either way. Ethan had said yes immediately, and Marcus had nodded once, and that was that. There were 9 men at the house that Tuesday. They ranged in age from 26 to 61. Some of them shook his hand, and some of them didn't. A man named Gerald, who was 58 and had served 2 tours in Iraq and spent 4 years after his discharge living in his car before landing in the program, looked at Ethan for a long moment and said, "You the new boss?" "Something like that," Ethan said. "What do you know about any of this?" "Not enough yet," Ethan said. "That's why I'm here." Gerald looked at him. Then he sat back down and said, "Okay," which Marcus told him later was Gerald's version of acceptance, and more than most people got in a first meeting. Ethan drove home from that visit and sat in his truck in the parking lot of his apartment building for 10 minutes. He thought about the 23 men on the waiting list. He thought about Thomas Brooks on a Cincinnati sidewalk. I thought about what Gerald's face looked like when he talked about the years in the car. Not broken, not bitter. Just factual, the way people talk about things they've survived but haven't finished processing. The following week, he called Marcus. "The 23 on the waiting list," he said. "I want to move them by end of year. All 23. What do we need?" Marcus was quiet for a second. "I told you the number. 414,000 annually." "I know the number. I'm asking what else? Beyond the money. What else is standing in the way?" Another pause. Longer. "2 of them have outstanding legal issues that complicate housing placement. 3 need intensive case management that we don't currently have staff capacity for. The rest are purely a funding issue." "Get me the legal file on the 2, Ethan said. "I want to understand the specific barriers. And on the 3 who need intensive case management, what would it cost to add that capacity?" 1 additional case manager full-time would cover it. 62,000 with benefits. "Approved," Ethan said. "Post the position Monday." Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, "You're moving fast." 23 people have been waiting, Ethan said. Fast is relative. He heard Marcus breathe out slowly on the other end. Not relief exactly. Something harder than relief. The sound of a man who has been fighting for something for a long time and has just felt the ground shift beneath his feet in the right direction. "I'll get you the legal files by end of week," Marcus said. By June 17 of the 23 veterans were in long-term placement. The remaining 6 were on track for placement by September. Ethan knew each of their names. He left the depot in July, his last day. The crew threw him a going-away party in the break room that involved a sheet cake with a bus drawn on it in blue frosting, and Dale Huffman giving a speech that managed to be both genuinely moving and completely Dale, which is to say, it included 2 unnecessary opinions, 1 factual error, and a moment of real unguarded warmth that Dale immediately covered by making a joke. Ethan ate 2 pieces of cake and shook every hand and thought about the 11 years he'd spent in those bays and felt without embarrassment, grateful for all of it. The work had been real. The people had been real. None of it was nothing. His supervisor, a veteran named Chuck, who'd hired him 11 years ago and never once asked him to do anything. He wouldn't have done himself, shook his hand at the door and said, "You're going to be great at this." "I don't know about that," Ethan said. "I do," Chuck said. "Because you were great at this." He gestured at the depot. "And this and that aren't as different as they look." Ethan carried that with him. The full-time shift to the foundation changed everything about his days, and nothing about who he was. He was in the office by 7:30. He read every program report that crossed his desk. He visited every program site in person within the first 6 months, not announced visits, just showing up the way he used to show up at every bay in the depot, because you learned things on the floor you couldn't learn in the office. Program staff started calling him directly with problems, which Patricia said was unusual for a steward and probably healthy. He started a monthly open meeting for the full staff. No agenda, just questions and answers. Anybody could say anything. And the first 2 were awkward. And the third one was where Sandra Kim said out loud that the education program needed a structural overhaul that would require a budget increase of 20%. And the room went very quiet, and Ethan said, "Walk me through the case," and she did for 45 minutes. And at the end he said, "How soon can we start?" The room had gone quiet again, but different this time. That was month 7. By month 10, the college persistence rate for scholarship students was up 6 points. By month 12, the foundation had housed 489 families, up 18% from the previous year. Ethan didn't celebrate these numbers publicly. He put them in a document he kept on his desktop called Simply Evelyn and updated it every quarter and never showed it to anyone. Noah was 8 when all of this started, and 9 by the first anniversary of Whitfield's visit. He'd adjusted to his father's new life with the same serious, steady adaptability he brought to everything. New school schedule to Ethan's changed hours, new routines, new conversations over dinner, about things that hadn't been dinner conversation before. He asked questions, good ones, the kind that made Ethan stop and actually think. "Dad," he'd said one night in October over pasta, "what happens when you run out of money?" Ethan looked at him. "The endowment replenishes annually, as long as the investment arm is managed responsibly. The funding base is sustainable for the foreseeable future." Noah stared at him. "I don't know what that means." "It means there's more coming in every year than we're spending, like if your allowance refilled itself." "Oh." Noah processed this. "So you can keep helping people. That's the idea. Forever. If we do it right." Noah thought about that for a moment, poking at his pasta. Then, "Evelyn was really smart." "The smartest person I've ever met," Ethan said. "And I only knew her for about 40 minutes. Noah looked at him. "You knew her longer than that. You went to the hospital." "A few hours total," Ethan said. "Maybe 3. "That's enough time," Noah said with the certainty of a 9-year-old. "You can know a lot about a person in 3 hours if you're paying attention." Ethan looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "You can." The second year moved faster. Not because the work was easier, but because he'd stopped spending energy on figuring out the structure and could direct all of it toward what the structure was supposed to accomplish. He brought 2 new program directors onto the team. A woman named Diane Marsh, who built a single-parent support initiative that partnered with local employers to create flexible schedule jobs, and a man named Tom Reeves, who had spent 15 years in the criminal justice system as a public defender and understood exactly where the pipeline from housing instability to incarceration had its critical leverage points. The single-parent program was Ethan's specific addition. It hadn't been in Evelyn's original portfolio. He'd brought it to Patricia 6 months in, laid out the case over a Tuesday morning meeting, and waited. Patricia had listened without interrupting, which was her version of complete engagement. At the end, she'd said, "Is this personal?" "Yes," he said. "That doesn't mean it's wrong." "No," she'd agreed. "It doesn't." She'd paused. "Is this about you, or about the people the program would serve?" He looked at her. "I was a single parent making $51,000 a year. I made it work because I was lucky in ways most people aren't. Stable job. Good coworkers. A neighbor who watched Noah when I needed her to. I know exactly which of those lucky things most single parents don't have. So yes, it's personal. And yes, it's about the people." Patricia had nodded once. "Build the program," she said. By the end of year 2, 312 single parents had enrolled. 206 had secured stable employment with flexible scheduling. 141 had avoided eviction through emergency support in the first 6 months of the program. Ethan added those numbers to the document on his desktop. The document was getting long. The thing that nobody outside the foundation saw. The thing that Ethan never talked about publicly, because it wasn't public, it was just true, was what the work did to him. Not the achievement of it. Not the numbers. The actual contact of it. The Tuesday afternoons, when he sat with families who were 2 weeks from the street and listened to them describe the specific grinding arithmetic of poverty, the way it never let you make a decision without 5 other decisions cascading from it, the way one unexpected expense could undo 6 months of stability, the way shame accumulated around the inability to provide until it became its own additional weight on top of everything else. He understood that arithmetic. He'd lived adjacent to it for years. And understanding it made him better at the work, and the work made him understand it more, and somewhere in that loop he became something he couldn't have named at the start, but that he recognized when he saw it in the mirror as the thing he'd been moving toward for a long time. In March of year 2. 13 months after the signing, 25 months after the night at Patty's, something happened that stopped him cold. How was at a foundation event? Not a gala, not a fundraiser. Ethan had made it clear early on that he wasn't interested in the kind of charitable events where wealthy people paid $500 a plate to feel good about themselves for one evening. This was a community gathering at a church hall in the east side of Boise, an open house for families who'd been served by the foundation's programs. No press. No donors. Just the people and the staff and food that someone had cooked because feeding people was the whole point. I was talking to a woman named Rosa, 43 years old. 3 kids had been 2 weeks from eviction. 14 months ago, when the family services program had stepped in, when a man tapped his shoulder. He turned around. He had never seen this man before. 60s gray at the temples, wearing a jacket that had been pressed carefully for an occasion. He was holding a paper cup of coffee and looking at Ethan with an expression that was doing a lot of things at once. "You're Ethan Carter," the man said. "I am," Ethan said. "I'm Gerald Webb," the man said. "Marcus's father." Ethan went still. Marcus had a father named Gerald. He'd mentioned him once briefly in the context of family estrangement, a relationship that had frayed during Marcus's worst years after his discharge and never quite been repaired. "Marcus told you about me," Ethan said. "Marcus doesn't know I'm here," Gerald Webb said. He looked at his coffee cup. "I live in Portland. I drove up this morning. I've been trying to figure out how to reach out to Marcus for 2 years. I didn't know how." He looked back at Ethan. "Someone told me about this event. Someone who works at the house where Marcus works. They said if I wanted to find a way back to my son, I should start here." He paused. "I don't know if that's true, but I didn't know where else to go." Ethan looked at this man. 60-something, pressed jacket, paper cup of coffee, standing in a church hall in Boise, asking a bus mechanic for help finding his son. He thought about Evelyn, standing at the door of Patty's, turning back, choosing to sit down when she didn't have to, asking the question that mattered instead of the one that was comfortable. "Come with me," Ethan said. He found Marcus across the room talking to Ray. He caught Marcus's eye and gestured him over. Marcus excused himself and walked across and stopped when he saw his father. The room kept going around them. Conversation, laughter, the sound of kids running somewhere in the back. But the 3 of them stood in a small pocket of complete stillness. Marcus looked at his father. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. "Pop," he said. The word came out rough, like it had been sitting somewhere for a long time. Gerald Webb looked at his son. His eyes had gone bright. "Marcus." Ethan stepped back. He gave them the room in the way that mattered, not by leaving, but by becoming invisible. Turning back to the gathering, letting the conversation around him pull him back in and close the space behind him. He didn't look back. 15 minutes later, Marcus appeared at his elbow. "How did you know?" Marcus said. His voice was controlled, but something in it was different. Scraped clean. "I didn't do anything," Ethan said. "He drove from Portland. You brought him to me." "He found his own way here," Ethan said. "I just walked him across the room." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked away. Then he said very quietly to no one in particular, "This work?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "I've been here 7 years," Marcus said. "I've seen a lot. I still don't." He stopped, swallowed. "I still don't always know why it works when it does." "Me neither," Ethan said. "I think that's okay." Marcus nodded once. Then he straightened up the soldier's posture, returning, and said, "I need to get back to my father." "Go," Ethan said. He watched Marcus walk back across the room. Watched the 2 men stand close together, not touching yet, but close in the particular way of people who are figuring out how to cross the distance that time and hurt has put between them. He felt Evelyn in the room, not literally. He wasn't a man who believed in literal things that couldn't be proven, but he felt the through line of it. The meal at Patty's, the lawyers at the door, the signed documents, the veterans, the families, the scholarships, Sandra's exit interviews, Diane's single-parent program, and now this, a father and a son, across a room at a church hall in Boise, because the work had created the conditions for them to find each other. The same way the work always worked, not in straight lines, not in predictable ways, but in the lateral, unexpected human way that real change moved through real communities. Dignity first. Systemic change. No one left invisible. He understood it differently now than he had when he'd first read it. He'd read it as a mission statement. He understood it now as a description of something alive. Year 3 brought the first external recognition. A regional nonprofit association nominated the Brooks Meridian Foundation for an Organizational Excellence Award. Ethan's instinct when Patricia told him was to decline. She'd looked at him with the flat patience she'd perfected over 2.5 years of working with him and said, "Ethan, the visibility matters, not for us, for the people trying to find us." He'd thought about that. "You're right. I know," she'd said without any satisfaction in it, because she genuinely didn't care about being right, only about the work being right. I went to the ceremony. He wore a suit for the first time in his adult life, which Noah found so startling that he took a photo on his phone and sent it to Mrs. Garland, who sent back 3 exclamation points. He accepted the award on behalf of the staff, said 4 sentences, thanked the team by name, all 43 of them, which took the longest part of those 4 sentences, and sat back down. Afterward, a man from another organization, well-dressed and practiced at these events, came up to him and said he'd heard the foundation was expanding, and asked what Ethan's vision was for the next 5 years. Ethan thought about it. Really thought about it the way he always did when someone deserved a real answer. "To be honest," he said, "my vision is to be the kind of organization that the people we serve would describe to their neighbors as the place that actually showed up. Not the place with the nicest brochure. The place that showed up." He paused. "Everything else is just the work of getting there." The man nodded slowly. "That's not a typical answer." "No," Ethan said. "Probably not." Noah turned 13 in year 3. He was tall now, still carrying that left cheek dimple, still possessed of the kind of quiet observational intelligence that made adults in conversations with him occasionally forget they weren't talking to another adult. He'd started volunteering at the foundation on Saturday mornings, filing, making copies, sitting in on community intake meetings, when Patricia said it was appropriate, and the families agreed. One Saturday in November. Ethan watched Noah sit across from a single mother named Angela, who was 41 years old, and so exhausted she could barely hold her head up, and watched his son listen to her with complete, full, unhurried attention and thought. He already knows how to do this. He's always known. Angela had looked at Noah halfway through and said, "How old are you?" 13, Noah said. She'd shaken her head slowly. "You listen like a grown man," Noah had said simply. "My dad taught me that if someone's talking, they deserve your full attention, because they're trusting you with something." Ethan had turned away before his face did something he wasn't prepared to manage in front of Angela and the intake coordinator. The heater in the old apartment was fixed permanently now. They'd moved not far, not to something extravagant, because that wasn't who Ethan was, into a house with 3 bedrooms on a quiet street on the northwest side, with a yard and a garage where Ethan kept tools he used on weekends when he needed to remember what it felt like to fix something with his hands. He still ate the meatloaf at Patty's once a month, always the same booth by the window, always with Noah when Noah's schedule allowed. Donna still worked there. She'd noticed sometime in year 2 that something about him was different, not the money, she didn't know about the money, just something in the way he carried himself, some weight that had shifted. She'd said, pouring his coffee one Tuesday, "You seem lighter than you used to." He'd thought about that. "I have more to carry," he said, "but it fits better." She'd looked at him the way she'd looked at him the night he'd put his 20 on the counter. Flat, knowing 3 decades of watching people in diners. "Good," she'd said, and walked away. In year 4, Marcus and his father went fishing together for the first time in 11 years. Marcus told Ethan about it in a Monday staff meeting before the agenda started, offered it up as a plain fact with no performance around it, and Ray Dominguez said, "Marcus, that's wonderful." And Marcus said, "Yeah," in his flattest voice, and immediately moved to the agenda, and somehow that restraint made it more moving than any elaboration would have. In year 4, Sandra Kim's restructured scholarship program placed 37 first-generation college students, up from 23 the year before, and the persistence rate hit 84%, 12 points above the national average for similar programs. In year 4, the single-parent initiative expanded to 2 additional cities, Portland and Salt Lake City, both already within the foundation's operational footprint, serving 640 families across 3 states. In year 4, Ethan stood in front of a room of 60 volunteers at the foundation's annual Volunteer Appreciation Gathering and said the thing he'd been trying to find language for since the night he'd walked into a hospital room and met a dying woman who'd spent 2.5 years invisible in order to find someone worth trusting. He said, "People don't remember how much you had. They remember how you made someone feel when they had nothing." That's the whole thing. Every program, every dollar, every staff meeting, every hard decision about where the money goes, all of it is in service of that one thing. Making someone feel like they are seen. Making someone feel like they are not alone in this. That's it. That's what we do. The room was quiet. Then Ray Dominguez started clapping. Then Sandra. Then the whole room. Ethan stood there and let it happen. Not comfortable with it, but not running from it either, because Evelyn had told him the work deserved to be honored, and she was right about everything else, so he was going to trust her on that too. 5 years after the night at Patty's Roadside Diner, the Brooks Meridian Foundation had housed 2,312 families, had placed 419 veterans into long-term stable housing, had put 308 first-generation students through college with an 86% completion rate, had kept 1,044 families from eviction through emergency support, had connected 931 single parents with stable employment, had expanded to 11 cities across 7 states. 5 years after a man spent his last $20 on a stranger's dinner, Ethan kept the document on his desktop updated. He added the 5-year numbers on a Thursday morning in late January. 5 years almost to the week from the night it all started while Noah was at school, and the house was quiet, and the coffee was hot. He read the numbers back to himself slowly. Not with pride. Exactly, pride felt like the wrong word, too self-directed. With something more like awe. The specific awe of a person who understands that they were one variable in something much larger than themselves, that the tipping point had been a meal and a $20 bill, and a 7-year-old who worried about a stranger in the cold, and that from those 3 things, 2,312 families had a roof. He opened a new line at the bottom of the document. He wrote Evelyn's name. Then he wrote dignity first. Systemic change. No one left invisible. Then he closed the document and picked up his coffee and sat there in the quiet of the house for a moment, in the particular stillness of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. His phone buzzed. A text from Noah. "Can I bring a friend to the foundation Saturday? He wants to volunteer." Ethan smiled. Texted back. "Yeah. Patricia will put him to work." 3 seconds later. "That's what I told him, LOL. He still wants to come." Ethan set the phone down. He thought about what Noah had said at 13 to Angela, the exhausted mother in the intake room. "My dad taught me that if someone's talking, they deserve your full attention. Because they're trusting you with something." He hadn't consciously taught Noah that. He'd just lived it. The way his father had taught him the same way, not in lessons, not in speeches, just by doing it day after day, imperfectly and consistently, until it became the shape of the household and the shape of the boy growing up inside it. I thought about Evelyn writing in her letter. What I saw at that dinner table was not just a good man making a good choice. It was a good man teaching a child what good looks like in the specific and unrepeatable way that only fathers can teach sons. He thought about Thomas Brooks. He thought about Gerald, 58 years old, who'd lived in his car for 4 years. He thought about Angela barely holding her head up at a Saturday intake meeting. He thought about Rosa and her 3 kids, and the 2 weeks she'd had left when the program found her. He thought about Marcus and his father standing close in a church hall, learning to cross the distance. I thought about a freezing January night in Boise, a diner on State Street, and a woman in a worn coat who sat down at a booth and asked a bus mechanic why he'd spent his last $20 on a stranger. He thought about what he'd said. "It's not charity. I'm buying dinner for my son, and I'm buying it for you. That's just dinner. He hadn't known then how large that sentence was going to become. You never know in the moment you say the true thing how far it's going to travel. But that's the nature of it. That's what Evelyn had understood, had spent 30 years building a life around understanding. That one act of genuine human decency, extended without calculation, without audience, without expectation of return, does not stay contained to the moment it happens. It moves. It compounds. It finds its way into the lives of people you will never meet, who will not know your name, who will go to bed tonight with a roof over their heads and a letter from a college and a father back in their life, and a job with hours that work, and they will not know that it started with a $20 bill on a diner counter on a Tuesday night in January. They don't need to know. The work doesn't need a plaque. It just needs to be done. And in Boise, Idaho, in a house on the northwest side where the heater worked on both sides now, with a son who was learning to carry the same thing forward on a quiet Thursday morning with good coffee and a document full of numbers that were really people. Ethan Carter was doing it. He had been doing it all along. He just hadn't known yet how far one meal could travel. Now he did, and he kept